Hello, everybody, and welcome to this program on Alabama Women's History Series, Alabama Suffragists. My name is Alex Colvin, and I am the Public Programs Curator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. This series was begun to be a complimentary virtual series for our exhibit that's now open, Justice Not Favor, Alabama Women and the Vote. And that's open at the archives until May 31st, 2022. And you can come see it Monday through Saturday from 8:30 to 4:30. I'd like to make a few quick announcements before we get our program. We have a research rundown. Unfortunately, our research rundown this past Monday was interrupted with a problem with StreamYard. So we are going to completely re-air it. So we're going to have a new time slot for research rundown. This is on the 1950 census, and it has been rescheduled for next Monday, March 14th at noon. And it's going to be here on Facebook and YouTube. Next Thursday, March 17th, is our next Food for Thought lecture. John Allison will present Leela Seton Wilder Edmondson, Cotton Queen and Politician. And that presentation, we are planning on it to be in person, so you'll be able to join us here at the Farley Auditorium, but it will also be live streamed to our Facebook and YouTube channels. And lastly, we have a book talk on Tuesday, March 29th, as Carrie Fredrickson will discuss her new book, Deep South Dynasty, The Bankheads of Alabama. So without further ado, let's begin our panel on Alabama suffragists. Our first speaker is Monica Tapper. Ms. Tapper teaches history at Wallace Community College in Selma. She holds a master's degree in history with a concentration in public history. She's interested in the intersection where food and history meet, and you can learn more about that in her recent book, A Culinary Tour Through Alabama History. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Monica Tapper. Welcome.
Hey, Alex. Thanks for having me. I love talking about Bossie. Okay, so in 1914 to 1915, Bossie was one of the most famous Alabama suffragists. But before you can understand Bossie, you have to understand her father, Frank O'Brien, who lived about 12 lifetimes in his one lifetime. Okay, so he was an Irish immigrant. He and his family escaped the Irish potato famine. They moved to Pennsylvania when he was about 4. He ran away from home when he was a teenager, became a fresco painter, and ran around the country a little bit painting frescoes. He wound up in Alabama, married a girl from Montgomery, and right before it became the Magic City, he moved his little young family to Birmingham. He was also a Confederate soldier. He was owner and editor of a newspaper, real estate developer. He built the O'Brien Opera House. He was sheriff, mayor of Birmingham. And honestly, he did a lot more than this, but the slide could really only hold so much. Now, this is Frank as a Confederate soldier. He was captured twice, wounded twice. Nothing could kill Frank O'Brien. This is his opera house. He built this in the middle of a cornfield. Today, it's downtown Birmingham. So when he built this, all Frank could see was the opera house, but all the townspeople could see was a cornfield. They all thought he was insane, actually, but he ignored them and he built his cornfield, and the opera house became the place to be. People traveled for miles around to see the shows because, as usual, Frank was right. Frank had this ability to see things as they could be and not as they were. So this is his daughter, Bossie. She was born in 1876. She was the youngest of 4 daughters. She was educated in Loretto, Kentucky, in a convent. All of the daughters were educated in a convent in Kentucky. And this is her husband, Oscar. They got married in 1897. She picked him, she wooed him, she married him. He was okay with it. She said, I always felt that a woman had as much right as a man has to choose her mate. So she's already thinking ahead way back when. So in 1910, Frank passed away. Bossie inherited his traits. She could see what could be and not what was. And she really didn't care what other people thought about that, just like her dad. Frank died just of exhaustion. He was mayor of Birmingham, but he wasn't just the mayor of Birmingham. He was the first mayor of Greater Birmingham. This is when all the outlying areas were annexed to the city. And this is when Frank met his match. He got insomnia. He stopped sleeping. He went to a hospital first in Clear Springs, then he went to one in Philadelphia, and eventually the man just died of a life of too much and just died of exhaustion. 2 years later, Bossie entered politics. In 1912, she joined the Birmingham Equal Suffrage Association. In 1913, she was elected president. In 1914, she served as the chair of the state association, the legislative committee, and its chief lobbyist. So this is where things start to get interesting in 1914. She planned, well, not just her and her suffragists, they planned to lobby the Alabama state legislature to propose an amendment to the Alabama Constitution. Bossie was in charge of this campaign. The idea was they weren't trying to get the legislature to pass suffrage for women. They were trying to get the legislature to pass a vote so that the people of Alabama could vote on whether or not their wives and daughters could vote. Whether or not this would have passed is up for debate because it never made it. But she had lots of ways of going about this. And one of the ways was she drove through rural parts of Alabama speaking about suffrage. Sometimes she took a friend, a fellow suffragist. Sometimes she went alone. She got signatures for her petition. She organized new suffrage groups. And this is her car. This is her Hudson 6. So sometimes she had a driver. Sometimes she drove herself. But she actually loved to drive. So she loved her Hudson 6. And this is before the interstate. And this is before there were hotels on every corner. So she had to stay wherever there was space. In the northern part of the state near Tennessee, she stayed in a house where the supper included coffee as bitter as gall, taters cooked in the ashes, canned peas, and tall biscuits that were thoroughly raw inside. All of this revolved on a lazy Susan, the first one she had ever seen. At another home, she was served sow belly and a piece of lean. She knew that her host fed her the best of whatever she had. She didn't always sleep in bedrooms. There wasn't always even a bed, but she slept wherever there was space for her. So now, I love that she has a yellow suffrage tee. Yellow is one of the colors of suffrage, and she made use of this. And this method is a little more suited to the woman's sphere, but it's very creative use of the woman's sphere. So at a private club in Birmingham called the Southern Club, she color coordinated an afternoon tea, partly in yellow, party in yellow, one of the colors of the women's suffrage movement. She began the day in her own garden, plucking 4 dozen yellow irises to form an enormous sheaf. The display of her own irises in a wicker basket on Cluny lace, next to the display of yellow bonbons on the center table. There were yellow mints, yellow suffrage wafers, a bowl of fruit punch with chunks of orange sherbet, and yellow roses. Yellow shades were used to soften the lighting of the tea tables, which were accompanied by yellow flowers. And of course, she and her ladies had suffrage supplies for sale, including stationery, postcards, ribbons, and gardenias. And 50 people attended, which was a very successful party. Okay, so she sent out letters and forms to the entire Alabama legislature. She kept track of every no, yes, and maybe. If there was the slightest chance of turning a no or a maybe into a yes, this is when the suffragists went to work. They visited, they sent educational materials, anything they could do to convince them to change their minds. Okay, Bossie kept these scrapbooks her entire life, many scrapbooks. Most of her scrapbooks were given to her family, which have been very nice actually to share them with me. But this scrapbook was given to the Birmingham Public Library in the 1940s. So anyone can look at this. And it's great. It's got everybody, all 133 surveys and letters from all of these Alabama legislators. So let's see. This is an example of the form that she sent. So as you can see, she asked for name, occupation, religion, politics, whether he was a preacher, whether he was married, or a Confederate veteran, and then finally their views on suffrage. And then they made notes, which I love, on all the men and what they thought. So some of the questions are political and some of these are personal. Sorry about that. Okay, So this is a simple reply from Mr. Shapiro. He basically says, sure, I'll do it. I will not only vote for the resolution, but will do all I can to secure its passage. And if passed, we'll do subsequent ratification by the people. So typically the shorter the letter from the man, it's a yes. When it's long and rambling, it's usually a no. So this is from Mr. Lapsley. He does not think it's a good idea because it was not in the divine plan of salvation. I picked out some of the best ones to share with you guys. This is from Mr. Thompson, who thinks that women are too sweet and angelic like to reason. Accepting a rule without reason is just not good policy, according to Mr. Thompson. Now, Mr. Darden doesn't want to because of Negro women voters. All right, I'm not going to read you all this because it's very long, but basically the same thing for Mr. Easterly. I mean, he goes into much more depth, but it's the same idea. Okay, now, poor Mr. Oh my goodness, this man, I can't even read his writing. So basically the idea is man has always been and will be mindful of her and of her God-given function of making, caring for, and keeping the home, and caring for and taking care of the children. Establishing the family will be to some extent interfered with when she enters the political arena. And my favorite one of all time is Mr. Grayson. This letter was 6 pages long. It took him a very long time to get to the point, but he finally does at the end. Now, I don't minimize or denigrate the immense benefit wives are to their husbands. It is true they cook, sew, wash, polish, and sweep, but they also spend. They do but little productive labor that has produced but little wealth, and I don't think they ought to do so. Then why should those who produce 5% of the wealth want to control the management and taxation of 95%? And finally, Mr. Bird. True women are today ruling the world by rocking the cradle. So we've got some really juicy replies, and then we've got some boring replies. But basically, in the end, Bossie actually managed to get 52 votes in her favor, only 43 against. But unfortunately, this was 5 short because it takes actually 3/5 to be in favor, and 5 short. Had she gotten another 5, we may have seen how the Alabama men voted, but we never got that far. And that's Bossie in a nutshell.
Thank you so much for that wonderful view into Bossie Bryant and how she really helped shape that 1915 push. And I love that you included some of those surveys. We actually have 2 of the surveys on view here in Justice Not Favor. And so if anyone saw that and was really interested in it, you can come see 2 of them in person here. And we can talk a little bit more about those in a little bit. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex.
All right, next up, we have Dr. Tara White. Dr. White is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where she specializes in African American women's history and public history. Dr. White earned her PhD in public history from Middle Tennessee State University and her master's from the Cooperstown Graduate Program at SUNY Oneonta. Since 1994, Dr. White has worked with a number of universities, history museums, historic sites, and history organizations in various capacities. So please join me in welcoming Dr. White.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about Adella Hunt Logan, African American women, and the suffrage movement in Alabama. And so let me tell you a little bit about Adella Hunt Logan. She was an educator. She was a club woman, and she was also a suffragist. She was born and educated at Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia. She was actually a student of W.E.B. Du Bois while at Atlanta University. She came to Tuskegee very early and became a part of the faculty at Tuskegee Institute, working for Booker T. Washington, where she taught English and humanities and was a valued faculty member. And in fact, at some point became temporarily the lady principal before Margaret Murray Washington Booker T. Washington's third wife, came on board. She was a founding member of the Tuskegee Women's Club, and this was a local club of women who were faculty members and staff members of Tuskegee, created by Margaret Murray Washington and a couple of other leading ladies, including Logan, on the campus. These African American women decided that they would expand that club or the club ideal. And within the next couple of years, Margaret Murray Washington and Adella and other women go on to found the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. When Adella is active in suffrage and in the suffrage movement, and actually she is active from the very beginning, bringing the whole idea of suffrage to the Tuskegee Women's Club, and she's the point person for all things related to the suffrage movement, which, although is not very active in Alabama at the time, is in full bloom nationally. And so she is one of a few people in the state of Alabama who's plugged into the national conversation on suffrage. And she is the only woman in Alabama, Black or white, who is a life member of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is the branch of the suffrage movement that's active in the South. Adella goes on to sponsor a bunch of related things related to suffrage on the Tuskegee campus, particularly programs. She does a women's march for a particular doctors convention that happens on the campus at the John Andrews Hospital while she's there. She also was active in writing several articles on women's suffrage for national publications. Her most prominent ones being the one for the Colored American that she did in 1902, and then another very well-received article that she did for The Crisis, which is the magazine for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and that one was published in 1912. Unfortunately, Adella suffered from depression and mental illness. In addition to serving as, an educator, a club woman, suffragist, she was also a wife and a mother to 9 children, which she had some significant health issues, which contributed to her ongoing issues with depression and some mental illness later on in life. And when she dies, unfortunately, by suicide in 1915, she is not able to see, unfortunately, the work that blossoms out on the Tuskegee campus in women's suffrage, and not just for Tuskegee, in the larger National Association of Colored Women, women's group, and the work that leads to the passage, eventual passage of the 19th Amendment. But what's important also for Adella is that she recognized that African American families, women and children, needed to have the protection of the right to vote. And I wanted to bring out this particular quote that she had in her article in the Colored American magazine, which is 1905 as opposed to 1902. And she says here, if white American women with all their natural and acquired advantages need the ballot, that right protective of all other rights. If Anglo-Saxons have been helped by it, and they have, how much more do Black Americans, male and female, need the strong defense of a vote to help secure their right to liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness? And neither do the colored citizens of the Republic lag behind in the fundamental duties of taxpaying and using the elective franchise. The price of their freedom, as far as that freedom has progressed, was too dear a price to be treated lightly. And what she's referring to is, by this point, the gains of Reconstruction that they saw happen with the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, with African American men being granted the right to vote, and with more extensive freedom, seem to be rolling back. And this is one of the things that is causing some alarm as African American women are considering the right to vote. There is also at the same time happening in Alabama and other places across the South a movement for white supremacy, meaning the movement to instill and install an all-white leadership across the state of Alabama and across the South. And it's the thought that that the rulership of the South belonged to white men, and only white men were equipped to actually lead the South, and that African Americans were indeed not equipped to be leaders, and in fact inferior, and needed to be under the leadership and under the rulership of white men. And so at the same time that the suffrage movement is ramping up nationally, you see the movement for white supremacy that's happening across the South, moving across the state of Alabama. And in fact, although the women's movement and the suffrage movement in Alabama starts in earnest about 1890, it's also about this time that Alabamians are gearing up to create a new state constitution and start the conversation about changing the Constitution in an effort to eliminate African Americans from the political life of the state. And so at the same time that women are starting to talk about being included in the franchise, you have this movement to completely exclude African Americans from the political life of the state. And so what Hunt Logan wants to remind people in this particular quote is that, African Americans are contributing citizens. They are doing the things that they need to do as citizens. They are paying taxes, and they are voting. And so even though they're doing all of these things, right, that their freedom is, really tenuous at this point. And so she wants to remind people that if white American women who at this point have a protected status, right, that if they need the right to vote and they have a protected status, African American men and African American women need that right even more so. And so her work is a part of a larger work. And I mentioned that she was a member of the Tuskegee Women's Club. And Tuskegee Women's Club is founded in 1895. But a year before, you have the creation of a new organization that's created by the merger of the National Federation of Afro-American Women, to which the Tuskegee Women's Club belongs as a creation of Margaret Murray Washington, right, who was the leader of the National Federation. And then there's a New Era Club in New England, of clubs that are primarily in the New England states. And then finally, the clubs of the National League of Colored Women that are primarily DC area clubs. And so those groups come together in June of 1896 and they create this organization. And this organization is devoted to uplift for African American women and families. And they work for, the social and political and economic advancement of African American families more than anything else. These are middle class Black women. Most of these women are college educated, and most of them are educators by training. And so you have a local club there, the Tuskegee Women's Club, that's engaged in suffrage activities and plugging into the national organization. And you have this national organization that is quite plugged into the suffrage movement nationally. In addition to the Tuskegee group, you have the Alabama Federation of Colored Women that was founded in 1899 by Margaret Murray. So you have these levels of this, or these affiliates of this national organization, and these women are working across the country. There are clubs in just about every state of the union at this point, and these women are working to actually try to deal with the situation that they're facing in their communities. When they are founded in 1896, this is just as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision is being rendered, which stated that separate organizations or separate institutions or separate facilities for African Americans and whites are okay as long as they are equal. And one of the things that they knew and that we know from history is that that was not the case, that separate institutions were not going to be equal, that it was the design to have separate institutions as a way to imply the lower status or the second class status of African Americans. And so you have African American women coming into this situation with this new Jim Crow law, right? Or this new national decision that makes Jim Crow pretty much the law of the land in the United States, and sanctions legalized segregation across the South. And so these women are devoted to addressing the needs of African Americans in their local communities, helping to set up schools and work with women in their local communities and children and families, creating reform schools to separate out juvenile lawbreakers, as they were called, from adult prisoners. They set up programs for girls. And so these women are devoted to, a full program of caring for and uplifting African American families. And as you can see, you can see the theme here in the official shield for the NACW as lifting as we climb, because that is what they saw themselves doing, that as they climbed in status and as they increased in stature, that they would also pull up other members of the race who were in lower status, right? And so being able to vote then and having the opportunity to have access to the ballot for them would give them the opportunity to make changes in their own communities and to actually vote for policies that supported the work that they were already doing in these communities. And so you have her and these other women, who are working for suffrage. But I though I want to push past the suffrage movement, because what we find is that although Alabama women do not vote for, or Alabama doesn't go for the 19th Amendment, it actually fails on the state level. It does pass and is ratified on the national level. And you have these various forces that are working for suffrage and working against suffrage within Alabama. You don't have an aligned movement. You don't have a movement where Black and white women are working together. And this is part and parcel of the situation in Alabama, where, in many cases, the argument for suffrage is actually so that the white suffragettes and white suffrage movement participants could actually vote against African American male votes, and all of those votes that have not been canceled out by the 1901 Constitution and the subsequent voter disfranchisement tactics that have been introduced after the Constitution was ratified. And so you have that argument with the suffragettes. And with the anti-suffragettes, the folks who are against the suffrage movement, of course, see the movement for Black women having the right to vote as threatening, as a way to kind of backdoor the notion of social equality between the races. And so Black women, in this suffrage battle working within the state are really kind of caught in a cross-22, because you have the folks who are working for suffrage who are not working with them, and the people who are working against suffrage who are also working against them. And so once the amendment passes, only a few of them are able to vote, but they go out and they vote vociferously. You see, as soon as the amendment is passed, you have 800 women in Birmingham go and register to vote and actually get engaged in voting rights there. You have women in Huntsville register to vote. You also have women in Montgomery register to vote and become engaged in the local politics there. But the other thing that you have is you have a renewed commitment for African American women, and these are not just women in Alabama. You have a renewed commitment from African American women to actually make the full intent of the 19th Amendment, that all women have the right to vote, a reality. And so what Black women decide to do is they double up. They double up within organizations such as the NACW, and organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. You have women within the Women's Auxiliary of the National Baptist Convention, women like Henrietta Gibbs on the state level, and Nanny Helen Burroughs on the national level, and other women throughout the state who are working even more to make sure that universal suffrage, and that's suffrage for African American women and African American men, are become a reality in the state of Alabama. And so this work for universal suffrage actually ends up becoming part and parcel of the civil rights movement. This is the latter half of the suffrage movement that we see fulfilled by 1965 with women like Lucinda Roby out of Birmingham, and women like Rosa Parks in Montgomery, and women like Amelia Boynton Robinson in Selma. So, I want to, in addition to framing the conversation about suffrage, and ending the conversation and with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, for African American women, this is a conversation that extends beyond that and extends to 1965 with the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
Thank you so much, Dr. White, for both telling us about Adele Hunt Logan, but also expanding that conversation to remind us that not only do we talk about two parallel movements in the early 20th century, but we can't stop in 1920 when we're talking about suffrage in Alabama. So thank you so much for that presentation. And I look forward to talking to you more about it in a second. We have our live Q&A. Thank you. All right, and our final presenter, I am pleased to announce, is Dr. Hayden McDaniel. Dr. McDaniel is an education curator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. She has degrees in history from Troy University and Auburn University, as well as the University of Southern Mississippi, where she earned her PhD in 2019. Her research interests in Southern history include the New Deal, agriculture, politics, and civil rights. Today, she's going to talk about someone who lives close to her home, Scottie McKenzie Frasier. So welcome, Dr. McDaniel.
Thank you so much, Alex. And yeah, I'm so excited to be here, and thanks for hanging out so that I can share with you about somebody that is near to my home, but also near to my heart. Scottie McKenzie Frasier, who is a Wiregrass suffragist. So the way I want to get us started is for us to just hear from Scottie. Now, you'll hear a little bit about this recurring article that she had in the Montgomery Advertiser, and she was writing this particular quote about somebody else. But I wanted to insert it here because I think it truly captures her, as well as the women you've already heard about today. And so she wrote, "Tradition has proclaimed for so long a time that the Southerner is merely beautifully mannered and gracious, that it is almost impossible for the world to believe she is also capable." And while Scottie McKenzie Frasier was certainly beautifully mannered and gracious, she was also incredibly capable during a time that it was very hard for a woman to be capable and as successful as she was. So who are we dealing with here? Who is Scottie McKenzie Frasier? She is from Talladega, born there in September of 1884 to William and Leila Hood McKenzie. And she attends public school there in Talladega. It's very interesting. Some of the first things that I was able to find about her, like in her life, was her attending school and being on the honor roll and, being in plays and things like that. So it's very interesting to see her growth as a person. But in 1901, she graduates from Talladega High School and decides to attend the Judson Institute. And I've been unable to find what degree she actually took. But based on the things that she did later in her life and, considering the degree programs that Judson had at the time, I have to believe that she followed her heart and went with a degree from the literary department. So she attends Judson for 2 years. And in 1903, she passes her boards to become a certified teacher. And in 1903, same year, she graduates. Well, the first thing she does is she goes back home. Her first teaching appointment was in Talladega, and she stays there for a couple years. And then from there, she has a few different teaching stints across the state, including in Albertville, Greenville. And at that time, she gets elected faculty at Judson in 1908. But unfortunately, she doesn't ever take that role because she gets married to Dr. Alfred Smith Frazier in October of 1908. Well, the new couple doesn't hang out in Alabama for too very long because Dr. Frazier took a residency at the New York Postgraduate Hospital. So they moved to New York City. And this was a huge opportunity for Scottie because she was very much a go-getter, and she did that in New York City. She attended the Columbia School of Journalism to further her education, but she also picked up writing and voracious writing and the series in the Montgomery Advertiser, Alabama People Who Have Made Good in New York, recurred beginning in about 1912. And she writes this all the way from New York City, and she's very invested in Alabama still at that time. So it's during this moment in New York City that we get evidence of Scottie McKenzie Frazier's leanings on suffrage. Again, she starts that column in the Montgomery Advertiser in March of 1912. That's the earliest version that I've been able to find. And she used the vehicle of print to discuss her suffrage views. Often stated forthrightly, her views on suffrage were presented moderately, as she hoped to convert non-believers with logic rather than emotion. One of the major stances she also espoused was in the equality of the sexes, and this is almost to a fault. She always mentioned the role of men at the same time she discussed the potential changing roles of women. So by 1915, they've been in New York City for a little while. She does become difficult to trace because they move back to Alabama for a while, she and her husband, but then they immediately go back to New York City. But we do know that by the end of 1915, definitively, she and her husband are living in Dothan. And the reason that they came to Dothan was to capitalize on, surprisingly enough, this booming medical industry, or what they thought would be a booming medical industry there in Dothan. And if you're familiar with the Wiregrass, if you're familiar with Dothan, if you've ever heard of the Fraser Ellis Hospital, this is that Fraser. And so Dr. Alfred Smith Frazier opens that with his partner, Dr. John Ellis. And Scottie does participate in some capacity with the management of the hospital, usually with like meal planning and things like that. So as I've mentioned, Frazier was quite well known in both her social circles in New York City and back home in Alabama. So it's not out of the ordinary at all that she would be profiled, such as the article there in the center by Mrs. P.L. Matthews. She extensively profiles Frazier, detailing her role as a socialite, journalist, and suffragist. Of her views on suffrage, Matthews wrote, "Scottie McKenzie Frasier is one of the slickest little suffragists that ever came back south. She is so clever with her irresistible feminist arguments that even the crustiest old Southern aristocrats decide to let all the women, like her, vote after she has talked a while. Here is one thread Frazier liked to use in her pro-suffrage arguments. If those opposed would only allow her to explain the merits of suffrage, they would understand the need for women to vote." Matthews also proceeded to frame Frazier's perspective against the social concerns of women entering the electorate. If you'll pardon me, this is a little bit of a lengthy quote, but I think it really captures something here. So stick with me until the punchline. So Matthews writes, "When you get off to yourself, you can think of all those facts about women being exempt from jury service, army service, alimony, hanging, poll tax, and all those little things. You can remember that it is a criminal offense to speak out in public against a woman's good name, that swearing in the presence of women is punishable by law, that a man can be prosecuted for marrying a young girl, but that a scheming woman can marry a 16-year-old boy and there is no legal protection for him. You can think of just a number of ways in which men have sought to protect and provide for women because the women have had no voice in the government and because it is just simply the natural thing to do. All of these things you can work out in your own mind, but when you tell them to Scottie McKenzie Frasier, she will say, yes, of course, and it was sweet and lovely of them. Men are dears and I do like them. But you must not forget all those poor, unfortunate women and children who need women to vote." So this is the mindset that she took to Dothan. We know that Dothan had an unsuccessful first attempt at a suffrage club in early 1916. The first visit by a national organizer came in April of 1916, and she spoke at a courthouse there. In April 24th, 1916, article from the Dothan Eagle claimed that a suffrage organization was being developed. However, there's no mention of any members, any organizers, or anything beyond this fact to suggest that a sustained organization existed. The Eagle reported over a year later, in June 1917, that the same national organizer was again returning to Dothan to speak at the Rotary Club. 2 days after the announcement of the visit, Scottie McKenzie Frasier was named as the general chairperson of the Dothan Equal Suffrage Association, along with a full slate of members and officers. She quickly rose through the ranks and became recognized as a suffrage leader on the statewide level as well. This is not especially surprising, as she was already pretty well connected. She came on the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association executive board just as it was changing its organizing function. Around 1917, Scottie's activism evolved. A voracious traveler, Fraser was able to spread her belief in extending the franchise to women. In the later part of that year, she took one of these trips to Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and New York. On its face, and what the newspaper reported, was that she was going to visit friends. In practice, she worked to further the cause of suffrage. During this time, she developed another feature of her arguments. She claimed that suffrage was part and parcel of the overall war effort. One example of that came in an article from the Selma Times, in which she recounted her time in Ohio. She interacted with many women in her travels, and when they discovered she was from Alabama, they wondered if she wasn't from Montgomery. These women, primarily anti-suffragists, wanted to know the condition of the soldiers in training there. But Fraser was offended that they relied on women to see after the boys and pressed, "Why do you wish the women to see that your sons are protected from disease and temptation? I thought that your platform was one that says all women should protect the home. In fact, stay at home." This Ohio woman replied, "I do believe that a woman's place is in the home, but you see, Uncle Sam has taken our boys out of the homes and put them in cantonments, and unless the women look after the boys in camps, they are not looking after the home." Fraser deftly rebounded, "That's exactly my suffrage trump card. A woman's place is in the home, and the home is no longer four walls, but the world." This notion pervades another article, Suffrage Greatest Question Before Alabama People. But its two major focuses were that suffrage was a wartime concern and not a revolutionary idea. Fraser often compared men who neglected to support women's suffrage to the Kaiser and claimed that suffrage work is war work, and when we work for suffrage, we are fighting for the democracy of the world. On the meaning of suffrage, she wrote in a February 1918 article, "Do you know that women's suffrage does not mean tearing up the foundation of our society? It does not mean an overthrowing of our government. It does not mean a revolution. It means an evolution, and evolution means going from a good thing to a better." After about 1918, there are fewer articles that I've been able to find directly addressing her suffrage leanings. However, she definitely remained active within the Alabama suffrage community, delivering lectures to increase awareness and participating in the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association. She also continued her writing, society work, and through the duration, her efforts on account of the goings-on of World War I. She was one of the noted female speakers at the 4-Minute Men Conference in Birmingham. This was an initiative begun under Woodrow Wilson to deliver wartime-related information from the Committee on Public Information. The 4 minutes was meant to be short enough to keep people's attention, but also deliver critical information. She continued to be sought after following the passage of the 19th Amendment, regularly participating in the meetings of the Alabama Federation of Women's Clubs, Alabama Literary Association, and the Alabama League of Women Voters. Though she had been writing for as long as I can track her, it wasn't until 1920 that she published her first book of poems, starting the second stage of her writing career. She ended up writing 2 additional books, one based on a recurring series that she had in the Dothan Eagle called As We See It. She also served a tenure as editor for the Alabama Digest and briefly for the Dothan Eagle. Truly, I've only scratched the surface on the vast influence of Scottie McKenzie Frasier that she had in Dothan and on Alabama. She really is an example of a person that time forgot but shouldn't have. So I was honored that my colleagues wanted to mark her contributions in the current temporary exhibit, Justice Not Favor, which Alex mentioned is open through May 31st of this year. The first mention is a small interpretive panel in the case discussing pro-suffrage arguments from Alabamians. Because she was actually sharing FaceTime with the likes of Patty Ruffner Jacobs and other preeminent Alabama suffragists, I was so honored that they chose to showcase her alongside these other suffragists from across the state. So you can imagine how doubly pleased I was that Scottie somehow has 2 appearances in the gallery space. As I mentioned, after the passage of the 19th Amendment, Scottie did not just lose her advocacy. She continued to be involved. Evidence of this is in the Houston County Women's Poll Tax Register. In it, Scottie's name is listed, and according to this record, she paid her poll tax every year during the first decade women had the franchise. This is indicative of a few things, not least of which was the restrictive voter requirements placed in the 1901 Constitution, and I'd be truly remiss not to note that Scottie's name appearing in this book and having paid her poll tax is just further evidence of the particular privilege that she enjoyed. So I started with Scottie, and I want to leave you with Scottie. She wrote, "We are fighting for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own government." Though she was referencing the particular cause of women's suffrage, I think even 100 years on, we can all agree with her assessment of the precious privilege of voting and of being civically engaged. So again, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions. Feel free to leave those in the comments, but if you have something that comes up, please go ahead and send me an email. I'm happy to hear from you, and especially if you're having a question about Scottie Frazier. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Hayden. Thank you for sharing with us about Scottie McKenzie Frasier, and also how amazing a writer she was. All those quotes were perfect. But I also love that picture you showed of Justice Not Favor at the very beginning, because in that picture, all three of these women represented. We had Bossie O'Brien's dress. We had the case with Scottie McKenzie Frasier, and in that case is also Adella Hunt Logan. And so all three women that were discussed today were in that photograph.
I didn't do it on purpose.
It just worked out so perfectly. I'm going to invite our other panelists back on so that we can have time for Q&A. And so if anyone has a question for one of our audience, from our audience for one of our panelists or for the panel at large, feel free to put it in the comments. We'll be able to share it. I know we have at least one, but before we begin with some audience questions, I have a question I want to start off with that can kind of let people know how you found these women. You know, can you tell us a little bit about where you first heard about Bossie and Scottie and Adella, and you know, how you kind of did research on them, where you found them in the sources? And this can start with, how about we start with Dr. White?
Okay, I first heard of Adella actually as I was researching my it's okay. As I was researching my dissertation, which explored African American women and historic preservation, and I was looking at that through the lens of these club women for the NACW, and first saw the Tuskegee Women's Club, and that group had been really actively involved in preserving, helping to preserve the Douglas home in Anacostia, right? Mm-hmm. And so looking through their journals, actually their record book and other records, I saw this woman and I was like, wow. And what funny story, I decided to visit Anacostia while I was wrapping up my dissertation. And on my visit, I entered the Frederick Douglass home, and as I was entering, another woman was exiting. Now, the woman who was exiting happened to be Elizabeth Alexander. Elizabeth Alexander is a former faculty member at Yale, if I'm not mistaken, but she was also an inaugural poet, and she's now the president of the Melton Foundation. And she's the great granddaughter, I think she is, of Adella Hunt Logan. And so imagine running into her, and for those folks who have done dissertations, you know, you're oozing your dissertation all by this point, you know. So I ran into her and I went into this it must have been one sentence ramble about her great grandmother. And I know she thought this lady's crazy. But anyways, that was just kind of a weird past into present, you know, my present and past kind of bumping into each other. And so of all people to run into, I ran into her, and that was really some impetus for me to go back and look at her. But also I'd studied the civil rights movement and noticed all these women who were involved in the movement, and one how far that activism went back and realized that the activism for civil rights, what we now see as the 20th century civil rights movement, actually bumps back into the suffrage movement, right? That these same ladies and same organizations that are working for suffrage, the NACW, NAACP, the Women's Auxiliary for the National Baptist Convention, and those women leaders who are in those organizations are also later they're laying the groundwork for the civil rights movement that we see, come into full bloom in the mid 20th century.
Definitely. Dr. McDaniel, what about you? When did you first hear about Scottie McKenzie Frasier?
Well, I can't pinpoint the day, but I was finishing my dissertation and wanted something completely different. I was like, we're staring down the, 100th anniversary of suffrage, and being from Dothan, so I don't know if I said that already, but, this was very personal to me. So I was like, I knew about Birmingham, I knew about Selma, I knew about Huntsville, but I was like, who's doing this work where I'm from? And so I set out on this wild goose chase to find out who that was. I was open to whoever it was. So, it was a little bit of a trick to get started and find who she was, but it ended up being this really, dynamic person, Scottie McKenzie Frasier, who did much more than just her suffrage work, but a very big part of her life was that. So
definitely, so you can kind of see she's involved in all these different parts of the community, but also this writing. And I mean, just like you said in your thing, she started writing even beyond just the articles and the editorials and things like that. So she was just someone who was so involved in
definitely.
Dothan. And
she couldn't help herself.
Right. She's like, she had all the words in her heart. She just had to let it out.
She did.
And then what about with Bossie? When was the first time, and how did also, I know that you've done some creative approaches also to looking at food and everything. So tell us about when you first learned about Bossie and how you did research for her too.
Well, I had done a few minor suffrage leaders in Alabama for the Encyclopedia of Alabama. And Chris Maloney said, why don't you do Bossie? And I said, that sounds great. So he had a couple of connections for me. I was introduced to the family who was really nice and gave me her diaries. And then I found the scrapbook in Birmingham. And to be honest with you, I didn't realize how incredible she was until I got into it. And so once I got into it, it was it was off. So yeah, I've really enjoyed her. And I wanted to write about Alabama history through food. And luckily, Bossie wrote down everything that ever happened, including everything she ever ate. So it worked out really well. But sometimes when you read like old diaries, people don't realize the significance of what they're doing, but Bossie did. So she included everything. So I'm very grateful for that.
That's definitely, it's one of those things where, we don't always realize, if you're living in a historic moment, but all the things that we think of as being so mundane, in 100 years, they're going to think, wow, I want every single detail of what they ate,
Right.
of what they wrote, what were they thinking, where did they go to school, all these different things and your impressions. And so that's just the importance of things like journals and letters and now emails, things like that are going to be really important. And it's also to be able to discover these people again once. You might think that they'd be forgotten, but you have to try to rediscover them again. We have a couple of questions from the audience, so I'd love to share them. This one, for this first speaker, what is the building now that used to be in the field in Birmingham? So I believe this is the Frank O'Brien's Opera House. Do you know if it's still standing? And if so, where can people see it?
Well, the Opera House was changed into a different opera house under a different owner. And then after that, I think it became like a department store. And I believe it was torn down. The last time I checked, it was a parking lot. But I'm not sure. To be honest with you, I'm not 100% on that. So if anyone knows the answer, that would be fabulous. But 90% sure it's a parking lot today.
Cool. Yes, it's hard because I know there was an opera house that was pretty big in Decatur. For Susan B. Anthony actually came and spoke at it, and so we were all trying to find it to get a marker and everything, and then it turns out it burned down. And so there's all these things, especially with places. Sometimes it's hard unless they leave an address and you can try to pinpoint and maps are exactly the same. It can be hard to try to go back and find some of them, but I know people love going to a space and feeling connected to the history there.
Well, there is a marker there. Bossie put a marker there. So there's definitely a marker. You can go see it.
You can go see them. Perfect. There's definitely a marker there, so you can find it. Whether or not the building is still there, we think there might not be. Perfect.
Right.
Well,
good question. Thank you.
Yes, that was a good one. We have one here about the 1901 Constitution. I'm not sure. I believe that it is more about exactly where it is. So I'll show it here. It says exactly where it is. And I don't know if we want to talk about that, but we did kind of talk about the 1901 Constitution. And Marianne, we can answer your question more directly. We can get someone to tell you exactly where it outlines the electorate. But it made me think of trying to connect it in with everybody. So 1901, I know Tara talked about it with hers, but how really does that moment in the Alabama suffrage story kind of affect how suffragists start to approach what they're going to do, right? Because you have this early movement trying to get into the 1901 Constitution. So does it affect how they're approaching it? Does it affect your individual women? Do you think that they have any kind of feelings towards what happened at the convention? Kind of any way that it might have affected their approaches or their tactics for getting a suffrage amendment?
Well, what I saw was that so they actually approached the convention hosts and asked to be placed on the program, and they are given kind of a, they're poo-pooed, and people, the guys are like, oh yeah, let's let these women have a little say, and they go up and they give their speech, but no one really takes them seriously. They really aren't taken seriously, and partly because women don't have the right to vote and don't have the legal standing, and that's ludicrous for us to even think about that at that time, of course. But the other bigger picture, the bigger context, larger context for this is that, the 1901 Constitutional Convention really was about, African Americans. And that was the focus of actually making Negro disfranchisement, as they called it. It wasn't that the 1901 Constitution forbade them to vote or denied them the right to vote, but it is that before they did not, as women, have a right to vote. And the 1901 Constitution did not affirm or deny that. It just never addressed it, if that makes sense.
It does, yes. I believe, kind of when you see what the proceedings and I always tell people when I look at the 1901 Constitution as it is written, I try to figure if I could vote based on the restrictions there, not just even as a woman, but just purely the restrictions of property and things like that. And I think one way that they ensured that it wouldn't be expanded to women is that they did not specifically give it to women, right? And in the list of regulations of who is going to get it, they're very clear that it's a male over the age of 21. Mm-hmm. This amount of property, this amount of poll tax, this, the education, like different things, and the requirements and the restrictions put on it just kind of excluded women as even a possibility of going to be registered to vote. And so there's this wonderful moment. We didn't have someone talk about Frances Griffin, but she is this woman who goes in front of the 1901 Constitutional Convention and tries to really push for it, and she gives a wonderful speech, but is ultimately kind of ignored. Because as Dr. White said, that wasn't the point. The point wasn't about who we're going to expand it to, is about who we're going to restrict it from. So that was really a moment where you kind of see it stagnate. And then you see, movements like with Scottie McKenzie Frasier and Bossie O'Brien, Hundley really kind of flourishing again, trying to get that amendment to the Constitution. And on the state level, they're coming in another generation after the 1901 Constitution.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, Scottie Frazier graduates high school in 1901. So not to say that she's not politically cognizant, but I don't know that she was the developed person that she became when she was doing some of her later activism. But, you brought up Frances Griffin, and I have wondered since I figured out that Scottie Frazier was a Judson graduate, because Frances Griffin was also a Judson graduate. And Was there ever any interaction? Did they talk about it when she, went back to school that fall, about what Frances Griffin had done? Did she visit campus? So I wondered if there was any missed opportunities to kind of get that inculcated into her as a very impressionable, freshman.
Definitely. And then you kind of have, this other push, with the amendment, and Bossie is so involved in that direct push for the amendment. And so you can kind of see that there might have been some affecting of 1901, but it's also that's the constitutions they were dealing with, right? So that's where she's trying to get it. So even if she wasn't really as cognizant when it was happening, Adele Hunt Logan was probably the one who was the most involved at the time of the convention. But we have it definitely having these after effects into 1915. And that continued, as you pointed out, those surveys. And if you could talk a little bit more about some of the surveys, that they're so resistant. Mm-hmm. And so many of them are probably resistant for the same reasons in 1901.
Right. I love the fact that we can still see them 133 different reasons, either for or against. So, yeah. Did you have a specific question about that, or do you want me to share anything specific?
If there's any other kind of parts of the surveys that because I know you had to probably cut some of the ones. So is there any other surveys that you wish you could have shared?
Oh my gosh, there are tons of great ones. The funny thing is that today they seem juicy and odd, but back then they would have been normal. No one would have thought that was strange at all. So I guess it's you should always be careful what you write, because 100 years from now, you might be seen as, a little bit racist or sexist or, old fashioned or whatever. But yeah, a lot of these are very juicy. And I also like the fact that she includes, she's very serious about religion. She wants to know what their religion is, and she wants to know if he's a preacher. And Bossie was Catholic in a land full of Protestants. So for her, this was an important fact. And also whether he was a Confederate veteran. And I'll tell you right up front, not one of them was a Confederate veteran. But her daddy was a Confederate veteran. So for her, that was a big deal. So I just like the fact that she's not just political, she's personal as well. She wants, she wants them to, I don't know, be on stage for a minute, just a little bit. So I like that. She's pushy, she's aggressive.
But as Sarah Evans says, the personal is political. So
yeah, right.
Right.
They're all interconnected, trying to figure out what angle she can come at them for.
Yes, exactly.
To try to make it to this time, it's going to pass.
Yeah.
And as you said, unfortunately, it didn't pass.
She was so close, though. I mean, honestly, 5 votes out of 133, that's pretty good.
It is.
5 off.
It was this one moment where it could have changed anything. And one of the surveys we have here on view is one for J.W. Green. Yes, and you know exactly which one he is.
He's the traitor.
He is. Can you tell us a little bit about him and what he did?
Well, he told the women that he would vote, and I believe he's the one who actually put the amendment forward. And in the end, he changed his mind. He did not only vote against, he spoke against. He wrote in the newspaper against. Like, he was actively against this amendment that he pushed forward himself. So the women did not care for Mr. Green. Many, many notations are in the paperwork about poor Mr. Green. So,
and they called him.
I didn't include him because, honestly, that's a spiral. You can, and this was supposed to be quick, but yeah, Mr. Green is definitely the most interesting in there because he flip-flops, and the women don't like him.
No.
If I'm not mistaken, didn't they get out and campaign against Mr. Green based on his flip-flopping?
That part I don't know. So, but it seems like they would.
I think they did. I think they did actually campaign against him and said he was wishy-washy, and
he
shouldn't vote for anyone who's
and the person
who's as wishy-washy as Mr. Green.
Well, one of the great things in the surveys, you should never have asked me this, Alex, but one of the great things in the surveys was that it wasn't all just surveys from the legislators. Some of it is letters from women who knew the legislators. And so they give the women gossip. Like, there's a couple of letters where they say, I don't care for such and such legislator because, such and such, and my brother will be voting for this guy. And they're like letting you know the details. So it's not just the men, it's women who are related to the men or know the men in some way. They're giving them information that they can use. So, which I like,
Yes.
that's awesome.
It's trying to like every angle. And I was going to say to Tara's question, the person who actually ousted him and won his seat in 1922 is Hattie Hooker Wilkins, and she was the first female legislator.
That is awesome. How did I not know that?
And so Hattie Hooker Wilkins, and they called him the Dallas County Acrobat. And they outed him for Hattie Hooker Wilkins, who was a suffragist from
Love
Selma.
it.
And so I always find it's a poetic ending to that moment.
I knew there was I vaguely remembered this really funny story and chuckling in the archives as I was reading these newspaper ads about him. Yes, and I forgot that it was Hattie Hooker Wilkins who took his seat. Yes.
And so there's all this, that there is a moment where, you have in 1920 this great moment for, women and mostly white women. There are, of course, some African-American women who can vote in 1920, but then it extends 1965, and women are really central to so much of the movements, both the early suffrage movement and the civil rights movement, and organizing, planning, and executing all of these moments. And before we go, I have one final question. This was a national commemoration, right? This is a federal amendment that happened. And so across the US in 2020, people were, commemorating women's suffrage. But why is it important in this national commemoration for us to look at local women at the state level, at our county level or city level? Why do you think it's important for us to focus on these women during this national commemoration? You can start.
Yeah. So, I mean, we all know the national story. We can all pick in a big sweeping narrative. We can pick out the major players. And sometimes I think we, inaccurately ascribe the successes to those national figures. But without these boots on the ground, the big push wouldn't have happened. I'm a firm believer that people, push the politics. And so we get a good look at that. But in a place like Alabama, you get to tell a really complicated story.
Yes.
You find these different figures and players, and you get to see how that plays out. And it's not just clear cut. And so by looking at this story and really examining the myriad women that were involved, even if they were for or against, complicated reasons for that. And I just think it really it helps us to understand Alabama better. It helps us to understand ourselves better. It helps us to understand, the progression of politics in the state. But I don't know how else to add that. But for me, it was a very personal story and helped me to sort of connect somebody that was involved in this very huge, important movement to a place that I was from and to things that I know about, like Fraser Ellis Hospital. My stepmom's a nurse and had talked about Fraser Ellis Hospital for me. And so making those connections on a very, very personal, very local level, that was also part of it for me.
I can't top that. I'm sorry. I'm not going to try. That's pretty good.
That was.
But I also do think the one thing I do want to. What, Dr. White? I'm sorry.
I do want to add a smidget, though.
I do want to add a smidget.
And I'm sloganeering today. I really am. The saying is all history is local.
Yes.
Right? And we tend to forget that, history in many cases, social historian here, tend to remind people that a lot of these national movements start out very local, and they, get a groundswell of support and get, people behind them, and then they become larger national movements that make real change. I think about, again, the movement for voting rights, which, starts in earnest, not just out of the movement for, the fact that African-American women were not added to included as much in the 19th Amendment, but because there are so many other forces, and they're moving for, and the term they always use is universal suffrage, right? And so it's this movement for universal suffrage and full universal suffrage that leads to a larger voting rights effort and voting rights movement as a part of not only the NAACP's work, but also the NACW's work, and the NACW, working in tandem with the NAACP through the leadership of NAACP co-founder Mary Talbert, who is also a founder of the NACW, and so is Mary Church Terrell. So you have these women who have all of these connections, guys, and they're using all of these connections and maximizing all of these connections to make all of these local movements, right, kick up into a groundswell of national importance. And so all history is local, and it's important for us to understand how what happens locally connects to the national narrative, and that in Alabama, because we don't think about that in Alabama. I'm a very proud Alabamian, and I'm always saying, no, sweetie, history might happen in your state, but history really happens in Alabama. And so, but we have to continue to remind people that, the history that has happened in Alabama, good and bad. The history that happened in Alabama changed the world. And that's what I love to tell people. So,
Monica, do you have anything?
Well, honestly, they're going to talk way better than I did, but I just want to say that sometimes when we see women on the national, excuse me, of course, when we see women on the national level, we're like, oh, this is wonderful. They do these great things. But when we see an Alabama woman do something that's magnificent, that hits a little closer to home, because now we can do something magnificent and wonderful. So I think that's another reason to study local, so to influence the women and girls in our own state.
I think that is perfectly said, because as everyone has kind of said in their presentations, these women have affected how you thought about the history, but also about yourself. And like you said, that national level, we can kind of put them up on a pedestal, but this feels real. These are women working in places that we know, in Dothan, in Birmingham, in Tuskegee, around this state, and they feel exactly like you said, they feel real to us. And that's a perfect way to kind of end it, saying, hey, if these women can do this at this level in Alabama, so can you.
Right.
And there's so many things that you can get involved in. And you can also leave a journal that will be super useful.
Everyone should.
Everyone should.
Let you know that.
So thank you all for talking about these women who in many ways are exceptional, but also can tell us about how Alabama women can affect history. And I look forward to seeing all of you again next month when we have our next Alabama Women's History series on April 20th. And it's going to be about Helen Keller. So thank you both. So thank you all for being here. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.